Angela from Natural Living Alchemy. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be making homemade butter from heavy whipping cream. Now, if you already know how to make whipping cream from heavy cream, you are halfway there. If you've never made whipping cream from heavy cream, don't worry, you're still in the right place. But basically, you get butter from over whipping cream until it starts to separate into two components, into butter and buttermilk. Now, I do want to preface this video with just a couple statements here. I'm not going to tell you that this is going to be cheaper than buying butter, because it's really going to depend on where you live. But I like to use this recipe when my cream is actually just getting close to expiring and I don't want to waste it. Now, approximately 2 cups of cream are going to get you half a cup of butter and 1 cup of buttermilk. So that would mean if 1 liter contains 4 cups, you could expect to get 1 cup of butter and 2 cups of buttermilk out of your cream. Where the rest disappears to, I have no idea. If you have an idea, comment below this video and let me know. But I don't know, one of life's great mysteries, I guess. So before we get to the process, I just want to talk about the kind of cream you're going to need in order to make your own butter. So we have a rule of thumb here. The higher the milk fat content, the more butter you will get out of your cream. Now, if you can get raw cream right from a dairy farm, absolutely use that. That is perfect. But if you can't, if you're like me and you just have to go to the store and see what you can find there, you're going to need to make sure that you have at least 33% milk fat. Ideally, if you could get 40, that is even better. If your cream does not contain enough fat, it cannot separate easily, and this is why we don't use milk, half and half, or even coffee cream. So let's talk about how this process works. So fat in cream is basically little fat sacs suspended within the milk. And when you agitate the cream, these little fat sacs start to bump into each other, eventually breaking apart, releasing the fat molecules. Our goal with making homemade butter is to whip the cream to incorporate air into those fat molecules. And then by continuing this motion, the fat molecules begin to essentially bump into each other, clumping together and deflating the whipped cream. So this is when the fat starts to separate from the liquid and you start to get your butter and your buttermilk. The buttermilk that you're going to be getting out of this process will not perform the same way as commercial buttermilk from the store would in recipes. Now, personally, I like to use the buttermilk I get from this process when I make things like mashed potatoes or scrambled eggs, and I just replace the milk portion with this buttermilk portion. If you do want to use the buttermilk in recipes calling for buttermilk, you would need to add vinegar or lemon juice so that it would react with the baking soda in an expected way. To chill the cream or not chill the cream? That is the question. So my answer to this, do whatever you want. I have seen people swear both ways are the only accurate and true way. So some say do it with warm cream, others say do it with cold cream. Use whatever you want. I personally just use it straight out of the refrigerator, but others have said if you use cream that's a little bit warmed or at room temperature, it will churn more efficiently. So let us talk about our equipment that we are going to require. I'm going to be using my stand mixer and I'm going to use my paddle attachment. I do find that the paddle attachment works a little bit better than the whisk attachment, but you can try either or out for yourself. Excellent. And then you're also going to need a mixing bowl. Now, both my paddle and my bowl were chilled in the freezer overnight. I find that this also helps the process. Other things that you are going to require would be a bowl, because we are going to be rinsing our butter off later. And in this bowl, you are going to require some ice water. I just don't need to have it out yet. You'll also need, I like a spatula and a wooden spoon. Once everything is separated, in your bowl here, we're going to have to separate the butter from the cream. So that's when this little setup comes in handy. So I like to take just another glass bowl, a little fine mesh strainer. I have my nut milk bag that is committed only to dairy. When I make different dairy things like cultured dairy or butter or yogurt. Cheesecloth will also work. I like to use rubber gloves because when you are rinsing the butter, it gets cold on the hands, and I find that that helps. Plus, it just helps to keep your hands from getting all messy and buttery. So our ingredients is super simple. You are going to just need heavy cream. Now, I used a little bit out of this carton to make a recipe last week. So mine is filled up to about here. So I'm not working with the full 1 liter, but it is definitely close enough. So you're going to begin by just pouring your cream into the bowl of your mixer. Then once that is in the bowl, you're going to close it down, and we are going to start whipping this cream at medium speed. And we're going to whip it until it starts to get thick. Okay, and then we're going to keep whipping it because once it gets thick, it will then start to change color a little bit. It's going to go from a nice white color. It's going to start turning a little bit yellow as that milk fat starts to separate. Okay, now periodically you are going to want to stop your mixer, grab your spatula, and just clean off the sides of the bowl. So we are going to start by turning this on, and we are going to turn our mixer on to medium and just let it start whipping that cream up. All right, so we can see now how thick everything is. We've been going for about 17 minutes and 45 seconds. Okay, now yours might go quicker or it might take longer than mine. This is just where mine is at. So we are going to scrape down the sides of the bowl again. And then you'll notice that, yes, it is definitely getting very, very fluffy. You're going to notice that shortly it is going to start deflating, and that is what we're wanting. We are wanting to over whip this cream. Now, pretty shortly, it is going to start to go grainy and it will start to separate. Now, right now, it is starting to smell a little bit more butter-like than it was in the beginning. So that is also another good sign. Okay, so we're not done yet, but I want to show you where we are at. So as you can see, it is a lot thicker than it was, and it's actually starting to look a little bit grainy, which is what we want. So I'm just going to give it another really good scrape. And then if you notice in the bowl, things are starting to get pretty jiggly. If you look at the bottom, you can start to see now that the buttermilk is finally starting to separate from the butter solids. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to just give this a mix for a couple more minutes because we look like we are on the verge of starting to separate into milk and buttermilk. And then once everything starts to look like this, where you can see the butter solids, which are kind of clumpy and yellow, and now you can see all of the buttermilk collecting in the bottom of the bowl, and this is where we want to stop whipping and move on to the next step. So once your buttermilk and your butter have separated, what we are going to do now is we are going to separate the buttermilk from the butter. And the way that we would do that is, this is where I like to add in the rubber gloves. You're just going to begin to grab the butter out of your bowl in amounts that are comfortable to work with in your hand, and you're just going to gently squeeze the buttermilk out of the butter. So I'll show you what I mean. I like to just grab a handful, and then literally you're just going to squeeze the buttermilk out. Now we are going to be rinsing it off next, but you do want to make sure that you do have as much squeezed out as you can. So once you get the majority of the butter from the buttermilk out of your bowl, what I'm going to suggest you do is we're just going to remove this, because we are going to let it finish dripping. But first, I want to get the rest of the butter from the buttermilk in our bowl. So what I'm going to do is just grab my piece of cheesecloth and then just pour what's in here through our strainer. But what we'll do is just grab this little bit from here, and you're just going to squeeze it. And then we are going to put this little bit of squeezed butter in with the rest that we got out of the bowl. Perfect. And then we will just put all of that in here. I like to just give it a little bit of a squeeze just to get some more of the buttermilk out. But then what we're going to do is we are going to allow this to drip over our bowl for about 10 to 15 minutes just to get some more of that buttermilk out. Okay, so we are just going to leave this for a couple minutes to drip, and then I'm just going to go over the rest of the things that you need to know after I wipe some of this mess up. Now, while we are waiting for this to kind of just sit and drip for a couple more minutes, I did empty our buttermilk out from in here, just because at the bottom of the butter was sitting at the top of the buttermilk, and I figured it seems counterproductive if you are trying to separate the two to have one still sitting in the other. Okay, so let's go over some notes and substitutions before we finish up this butter while it is dripping. So technically, you could use a hand mixer instead of a stand mixer. Other things that you could use would be a blender or a food processor, and you would use those just by putting the cream in the blender and letting it run until the butter separates from the buttermilk. You could also use a mason jar just by filling the jar halfway with cream, put on the lid, and then give it a good shake for 10 to 15 minutes, and then your butter will start to form and separate from that buttermilk. You could also use a butter churn and just agitate the cream until the buttermilk separates. Now, I have this little fancy thing. So this is a Pampered Chef product. This is it's used to make whipped cream. You could also use something like this to make butter. Basically, if you were making whipped cream out of this, I would do the same thing with the butter. Fill it up to this fill line. If it was whipped cream, you'd put powdered sugar in, but we aren't doing that with butter. And then you would just agitate this until everything gets thick, and then it does start to separate. Let's go over some storage options because you do have a couple different choices. So your butter can stay in the fridge for up to 2 weeks, or you can put it in the freezer wrapped tightly in plastic wrap, and you can freeze it for a pretty long time before it's going to go bad. I've heard of some people having butter in their freezer for years, taking it out, and it is still just fine. Now, one way I like to store mine, let's just move this one out of the way for a second. This is called a butter bell. So what we do with this is you go and take your homemade butter and you fill it into this top part, and then the bottom you put, there's about 1/2 inch of water in there. And that water is actually making an airtight seal from the butter, keeping it clean and safe. So I usually find one of these lasts me maybe a couple days on the counter before I have to fill it up. We do go through a lot of butter in my house, but this is another way that you could store it. Now, by storing it on the counter in something like this, it does definitely make it more spreadable than if you were just grabbing it out of the refrigerator. Okay, so now that this has been dripping for about 10 minutes, you can see we did get some more out. If we give it a squeeze, there is definitely still some more buttermilk in there. Now, what would happen if you didn't get all of the buttermilk out? Well, you would run the risk of your butter going rancid, because that is what the milk solids are going to do. So this is why it is really important that we squeeze as much out and that we do this rinsing step. So what this is going to involve is we just want to make sure all of the butter's kind of at the bottom of the bag. I like these nut milk bags, but you could certainly just use cheesecloth. I just like to close it. I don't want to lose anything, but you're literally going to then just put your bag of butter in the water, and you're just going to massage it and knead it in the bag and just get more of that butter out and just rinse it off. Now, you are going to want to continually do this step over and over until your bowl comes out clean and it's not milky like this. So I'm going to suggest you probably do this step, maybe repeat it 2 to 3 times, and that should be enough. But just keep going until it is rinsed out and your milk or your water no longer becomes cloudy. If you wanted to do this under drip or running water in the sink, you can. I just prefer doing it this way. It wastes less water, and I didn't really think that you wanted to watch me at my dirty sink that I haven't cleaned yet. So we are just going to keep rinsing this off until it is clean. And then also using the cold water will help solidify the fat, because butter is just milk fat. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump this out, and I'm going to grab a clean bowl, and I'm going to continue rinsing until this water stays clean. Okay, so as you can see, my bowl the water is staying fairly clear. So now you just want to squeeze as much liquid as you can, as much water as you can off of it. So we are just going to move this out of the way. Okay, so next you're going to take a piece of plastic wrap, and you're just going to put it, I like to just put it on a cutting board, but you can put it directly on the counter. So then you're just going to take your butter out of the cheesecloth or the bag. And then I just like to literally take paper towel and we are just going to pat this dry. So I like to do that just by flattening it out and then just letting the paper towel absorb any liquid. Okay, so once everything is dried off, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some more of this into my bell here. Since my hands are already buttery and I have my gloves on, it is just as easy to just pick some up and put it in there. Perfect. So I will change the water in that because it is a couple of days old, and then that will just live on my counter. Now for the rest of your butter here, so I just like to make kind of like a little bit of a rectangle, fold it over, and we're going to roll it into a log. Now, before you did this, if you were wanting to add salt, you would do so. So before we start rolling it up, we would just leave it flat. You would just make a nice flat sheet of your salt, or sorry, of your butter, and then you would just sprinkle some salt over top. So I'm going to suggest you start with 1/8 of a teaspoon and move up from there. If you make it too salty, there's nothing that you can do to make it less salty, right? But if you know that 1/8 of a teaspoon isn't enough, the next time that you go and do this, you can just adjust it according to your taste. So once the salt is on, you would just use a spatula or your hands to kind of press and work it in. If you were wanting to make something like a compound butter, this is when you would add your flavorings. Now, I do have plans on bringing you different recipes for compound butters in the future. I just wanted this one to be just regular butter. If you wanted to salt it, you could. I prefer to leave mine unsalted. So if you have your salt in, if you have your flavorings in, you would now just roll it into a log. I like to do that after you make the rectangle, roll it over, and then start to just press it down while pulling it closer to you, just so everything's nice and taut. Perfect. And then I just like to kind of roll it around and then just twist these ends in. And now you have your own homemade butter that you got from heavy whipping cream. All right, now we have our homemade butter, and this is ready to be used or thrown in the freezer to use at a later time. So don't forget to hit the like button if you've liked this video and share it with anyone else who you think might enjoy it. Consider subscribing to the channel so that we can spend more time together and that you don't miss future videos. But I just want to say thanks for stopping by today, and I'll see you next time.